Hey everyone, today we're going to rank every Dead by Daylight killer from least to most tragic. We have 5 tiers: not tragic at all, not tragic, neutral, somewhat tragic, and extremely tragic. What is and isn't tragic is kinda complicated, and also quite subjective, and a lot of these situations are fairly complicated, so if you disagree with any of these, be sure to drop your own thoughts down below. I obviously can't completely summarize how tragedy should be judged in this short little video about a video game, so yeah. Let's get into it. Let's start off with not tragic at all. The Nightmare, I think, is easily the least redeemable and least tragic character. He's a murderer and abuser, and torments people through dreams, embodying their greatest fears. There's nothing tragic about this guy. Same goes for the Doctor. Doctor tortured and killed probably hundreds, and did it all in extremely messed up ways, with the only motive being that he just kinda wanted to. Yep. Not tragic at all. The Ghostface stalked and murdered dozens through multiple towns, bragging about what he'd done in the local papers. He seemed proud to be the person who haunted these places too. Yup, no tragedy there. The Trickster is another case of enjoying what he does. There's little tragedy in his story. He uses his power and wealth to cause a lot of harm to a lot of innocent people, turning his victims' screams into music. Nothing tragic about him. The Shape is not really tragic as the embodiment of pure evil. He is what he is, the soulless shape of evil. There could be argued tragedy in how he changes from possibly a fairly normal kid into the monster he later becomes. I don't know, it's unclear really. I personally think he isn't a tragic character though, and isn't really meant to be either. Clown, despite having a bad father, still ended up being a twisted killer who cuts people's fingers off. There's no redemption there really for a small tragic element to his character. The way he uses his afterpiece tonic and goes around in a clown costume with a circus is super creepy, and there is very little to find tragic about his character, to be honest. The Oni is kind of similar in that he has elements of tragedy, but the bad things he has done completely outweighs those tragedies. The Oni has a very outdated and stubborn worldview, and is obsessed with his family's honor and legacy, and so attempts to rid Japan of imposter samurai. This leads him to killing potentially into the thousands though, which again kinda just cancels out any sort of vague motive or tragic arrival at that point. His father also attempts to draw him away from doing this, but he goes against him, and he even eventually kills him, which I think just lessens his tragedy. Moving on to the characters who are simply not tragic. Starting off with the Cenobite. I don't know much about his backstory, but after reading up on it, it does seem the way Pinhead became a demon was during World War I, participating in a battle and losing his faith in humanity, as he saw all of the fighting and horrors. He then finds the box and becomes a Cenobite. This almost makes him seem tragic. Equally, the time spent as a demon, killing people in horrible ways, and bringing them to the labyrinth kinda outweighs any tragedy of how he first reached this point. So I don't think he's that tragic, embracing the role of being a demon. The Blight isn't that tragic. I feel he's more just kind of negligent in how he created his serum to begin with. He didn't seem to think of the true consequences until they had come about, in the form of a mass grave he was thrown into, a result of his serum. Equally, the haunting pain he feels when he sees this grave shows he definitely didn't intend for any such thing to happen. Thing is, it did happen. It also mentions many of his methods being experimental, so he probably should have realized that there was room for it to go wrong. He then has a chance at redemption, but he decides to do some experimenting and attempting to break into the entity's realm. So, I don't think it's clear how good or bad he is, but I don't think he's particularly tragic either. The cannibal is the reason for many innocent people's deaths, all of which are brutal and cruel. Bubba appears to do these actions because of his family, who he's scared of, and who treat him poorly, and he sees his actions as protective of them. Thing is, he still kinda kills and eats people, which, you know, isn't suddenly cancelled out because his family were also horrible people. Also, I'm not sure if it's ever particularly explicit that this is the case in the original film. It's mostly just suggestions and hints. There's a chance if he wasn't raised by them, he wouldn't be the way he was, does, but the reality of the deeds he has done still greatly outweighs that possibility. The pig, I think, does have tragedy, but I do not think she is tragic, largely for the way she later rigs traps to fail, killing people and placing them in a variety of horrible traps. There are tragic elements to her, particularly her being framed and her addiction as a result. However, her joining of Jone and the twisted traps she puts people in is pretty evil. Her rigging of them is too, especially after her claim that she was saved by them. It's not a clear situation, but personally I think the tragedy she caused as a reaction to her own tragedy diminishes her as a tragic character, similar to Bubba's situation. Both were misguided, but I don't exactly think they're tragic. The Huntress is raised in the Red Forest, and witnesses her mother die when she is young, after she is impaled by an elk. She's then left to raise herself in the Red Forest. It's sad that she lost her mother at a young age, but this doesn't even begin to justify her stealing of girls and killing of innocent families, into the hundreds. It's one thing doing what you have to survive, but another I think to just murder anyone who comes near you. There's some tragedy in Anna's story, but I don't think enough to consider her a tragic character. Equally, the situation she was in wasn't particularly controllable from her young age. For many of these situations, these characters don't deserve what happens to them, but equally their actions as a result are often far too extreme to ignore, which I think is what kind of makes and breaks them as tragic characters, which is whether there's much resistance to where they eventually end up. Moving on to the neutral characters. The nurse's story starts off very tragically, with her husband dying, forcing her to work at Crotus Pren. At Crotus Pren, she experienced abuse and was surrounded by insanity, eventually wearing her down. Again, it's a bad situation, and her husband's death is tragic, especially when we hear Sally reflect on it during her tome lore. However, I think Nurse is more neutral because her actions as a result of this tragedy are quite extreme to say the least. She ends up killing everyone in Crotus Pren, patients and staff, under the idea that she is cleansing them. Again, there's tragic elements, but the sheer number who die because of her bad experiences definitely lowers her own tragedy. The Trapper is a character who has done some horrendous things, but it's also fairly clear that he hates those things, and was greatly manipulated by the entity, fighting back once he arrives in its realm. He seemed to have been haunted by the entity throughout his life too. Then again, his killing of hundreds of his innocent workers, and many others who tried to threaten the Macmillan estate, leaves little room for sympathy. I think the before and after of both Nurse and Trapper are so different though. They seem like nice, contented people, who then both experience death and end up manipulated by those around them and the entity. It partly seems hard to judge them so harshly, but equally we know that the entity's influence can be resisted, and the sheer number of deaths they cause undeniably removes a large amount of their tragedy. Pretty much all these people are innocent too, so at the very least, both Nurse and Trapper, although have very tragic things happen to them, the tragedy they cause as a result still cancels out any tragedy they experienced, so at the very least they're neutral I think, even though they're often considered as tragic characters. The Deathslinger is another character I want to place around this neutral area. There's partial tragedy, but there's equally enough bad deeds to kind of cancel out the idea of him as a tragic character. I think the biggest tragedy of Slinger is that he didn't use his great mind for something good, instead opting to use it vengefully, crafting weapons like the spear gun. He was taken advantage of by people like Henry Bayshaw and the prison warden, and this results in his violent reactions. There's some tragedy in him becoming the way he did, but he did still do some pretty bad stuff. Overall, he's somewhere in the middle I think. The Demogorgon is one of the most neutral characters I think. There's not too much understanding of what these things are, and how willing they have been to serve the Mind Flayer, or if they are entirely controlled by it. So when it comes to judging them, I feel they just perfectly embody a lack of intention, and so are simply neutral. The Executioner is in a similar neutral spot. He just kind of is what he is, largely because he isn't human and he's immortal. There's no personality really or drive, he's just given a task and he does it. It doesn't make him good, and he's definitely evil, but for tragedy, I think he's just neutral. The Nemesis, much like the Demogorgon, is basically a thing created for the purpose of destruction, and so not particularly tragic, yet equally not tragic. It's neutral as it was simply programmed this way and is controlled by a parasite. The only thing that disputes this is the apparent enjoyment Nemesis gets from hunting Jill, suggesting a far more sinister side to him. Again, it depends on the perspective I guess. I think as a lab created bioweapon, he's just pretty neutral. He was built to be a weapon, and that's simply what he is. Moving on to the somewhat tragic characters. The Legion are somewhat tragic, I think, partly because half of its members are nowhere near as messed up as the other. Frank and Julie are both pretty horrible and see most people as beneath them. If it was just these two being judged, they would be in the not tragic section. Together the Legion kill an innocent guy, which means they aren't tragic at all really. However, both Joey and Susie are heavily resistant to this, and are basically forced to help kill this guy by Frank. There is tragedy in that this group of misled and neglected teenagers ended up this way to begin with, half of them being manipulated by the other half. I think the best conclusion therefore is that they're pretty neutral in terms of tragedy, but I think the factors of their young age, their rough upbringings and neglect, and half of them appearing misled, horrified by the idea of killing, shows they are more leaning to being somewhat tragic. Very slightly though. The hillbilly was raised by parents who abused him, locking him up, only letting him out to kill cattle. When he's finally a man, he snaps and kills his parents, and a corrupt chief and his deputies, who would launder money for his parents. His killing of the chief and deputies and his parents are by no means okay, but they too are not innocent, and tormented Billy almost since birth, simply for the way he looked. The tragedy is that Billy kind of becomes the monster he was always viewed as, and probably wouldn't have become had he not been raised so horrendously by his parents. Billy isn't good, but he is tragic, I think. The Plague is quite a tragic character, who believes almost all her life she is following her god, when in reality it's the entity and its corrupt influence. This deep belief in something that is just evil is pretty sad, especially when she goes to the extent of murdering her mentor, her barn, and even giving herself up at the very end of her lore to try and rid the Plague from her people. This is a move that likely doesn't do anything either. She sacrificed everything and did all she could to appease her god, but it was false in many ways, and many of her people who followed her likely suffered. All the while, Adiris's intentions seemed pure in wanting to serve her god and save her people, except the entity wasn't. The Wraith is quite a tragic character, whose life is essentially ruined by the entity's intervention, haunting the events of his life. Wraith is born in Nigeria, and is young during the Nigerian Civil War, resulting in the death of his parents and grandparents. When another woman finds and takes care of him, she is also killed by soldiers. Only then in grief does Philip kill the men who killed her. He then moves to America and starts a new life, working at Autohaven Wreckers, only to find his boss has been getting him to crush people in the Crusher for all the time he's worked there. It's a crushing blow to Philip, who thought he'd escaped the trauma of his old life, and he kills his boss as a result, before the entity takes him. Philip is tragic because the evil is almost forced upon him, despite him always trying to flee it. Finally, the extremely tragic characters. The Hag is a tragic character, who basically just gets involved in something she didn't realize the full scope of. She gets in over her head with the hexes, and it has horrible consequences that she really couldn't have perceived, even with her grandmother's warnings. She's kidnapped by cannibals and almost dies. The only time she actually kills anyone is after she's become the Hag, killing her captors, and has essentially given herself up to the entity. Yep, it's pretty sad. The artist is definitely a tragic character, and is written as such. Her lore begins with the death of her brother. Carmina blames his death on herself, her grief leading her to art, and something to pursue. Her art attracts the wrong people though, and she is kidnapped. Her hands are cut off and her tongue is cut out. Finally, when it appears a flock of crows is saving her from her kidnappers, the crows also begin to attack her friends, killing them too. Despite these things not being her fault, she still blames herself for them, and the entity seems to force that idea also. Again, Carmina's story is really pure tragedy, and it's a pretty tough read. The Spirit is tragic purely because she is the closest to complete innocence out of the killer roster. Her only true downside is her family name, Yamaoka, and the baggage that comes with it, and that isn't even her fault. Rin, out of the killers, is the most innocent character, for the simple reason that she just hasn't really done anything to deserve such a horrific outcome. She's just a normal person who happens to have a cursed family name, which the entity appears to haunt almost. The most tragic characters I think are the twins. These two have a really rough life, and basically never catch a break, and it has nothing to do with what they do or how they act, but simply for the way they look, and the fact that they are conjoined at birth. Because of this, their mother is burnt, they're kidnapped and experimented on by a cult, and they're constantly hunted their whole lives. Victor then dies, and Charlotte is left alone to fend for herself. They're not the most innocent of the characters, but I think they are the most tragic. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to drop your own thoughts on this down below. Thanks, and goodbye.